Okay, so now let's look at different looping strategies like for loops and while loops. So, well, these are basically iterators. Sorry, my cat, my cat is playing on the desk, so you might be hearing some weird noises in the background. So, loops are basically iterators under the hood. An iterator is an object, and when you give an iterable object to it, it basically creates the system or whatever that lets you traverse the elements of this collection. Basically, you can loop through lists, tuples, or strings, and you can go through each element one at a time. So in for loops, we basically have a syntax like this, which doesn't show quite well here, but it kind of works like this. So we have for value in collection. So this value is just a random variable that you want to use to refer to each of the elements that you find in your collection. So I remember when I first started learning Python, I was like kind of confused because I thought this was like a key also, but this is just something that you pick randomly. And this part, of course, has to be the name of your list, your tuple, whatever you want to iterate over. And then you start your code block and say, do this, do that, whatever. So here we have a list, and in this list we have different objects of different types. We have a string, we have an integer, a floating point number, a Boolean value, and a tuple. Okay, so let's say I want to loop through this list to see the type of each item. I want to loop through and just check the type and print the type of each element. So because my list is called my underscore list, I'm going to use that here. But this item, this is just optional. I can also call it I, but of course, if I call it I, then I would have to change my variable to I inside my code block. For I or for item, or we can also say element, or just sometimes people write like this, lm, for element in my list. This is like basic English, actually. For each element in my list, print the type of my element. So this will actually loop through each of these and just print the type. And if we run that again, we see that it does the same thing. So the first is a string, the second is an integer, and so on. For loops, what these keywords do under the hood is actually an iteration operation. For loops are iterators under the hood, and an iterable object is an object that can return an iterator when you use the iter function. So, for example, if I do this, I'm creating my iterator object. Again, this is just my variable. So here I just called it my iterator so that, it's not too confusing. When I say iterator, it's not like a function or anything. It's not anything special. I can call it whatever I want, and then I just give my list to this iterate, whatever function. And this basically creates an iterator object. So when you print out the type of my iterator, you actually get this output, list underscore iterator. So this is, I gave it a list, and it's going to iterate over that list. In this my iterator object, at first it's going to keep my hello, and once I print that, it's going to start keeping 5. And then when I print 5 using the next operator, it's going to keep this, so on and so forth. So when I print this, first it's going to give me hello, okay? So now I've changed something in this iterator object. It no longer holds hello. It just got rid of it. It's a dequeued, basically. So if I run this again, now I get 5, right? It gave me my first indexed element. And then if I run it again, I get my floating point number, and I want to run it again, I get my Boolean number, and finally I will get my tuple. And what's going to happen after there, because I have nothing left? Well, obviously, it's going to give me an error, and it gives me a stop iteration error. It can't iterate anymore. It doesn't have any object left in it. Okay, so so for example, if I just run this again, because I recreated my iterator object, it now has all the elements in it again. So if I print this cell, I basically just list all of them. So what the for loop does is basically this. So now let's continue with the continue keyword. So we use this to advance our loop to the next iteration and skipping the remainder of the code block. So what does that mean? So as I'm iterating over something, I might want to skip over the rest of the code whenever I come across a certain value, for example. So in this case, I have a list where I have integer values and also null typed values. So if I actually try to run a code like this, where I'm trying to sum up all the integer values in the list, and if I don't do this part, when I get to none, and when I try to apply an addition operation on none, I'm going to come across an error. Okay, so it's going to say unsupported operand type for, plus equals int and none type. So it basically says I can't sum up an int and a num type. Num type? No, not a num type, a none type. So this part of my code does this. It loops over. So I say for every value in my array sequence, check if the value, if that element is none. And if it is none, if this comes out true, remember this is keyword, I think we've seen this, right? Yes, we did see is and is not. So if it is none, I'm saying, okay, then don't run the rest of the code. The rest of the code being whatever is indented, whatever is embedded under my for block. So basically, this line won't run when a value is none. And then we come back, we check again. If it is not none, for example, when we get the 4, it's not none, this comes out false. We don't get into this if statement. So this line can be executed, and then we go back up, and then we get to none, and then we see continue, and then we skip this, come back, and then finally we find 5. That is not none, so we skip this if statement, and then we run this line again, and then finally we just print out the result. So when I use this technique here with continue, I end up printing the sum of all the integers in my list. So another keyword that's used very often is break. You can either break, or if you're in a method, a function, you can also do return, right? So in a specific part of your block, you can say return, and then you'll go back to wherever you called that method from. This is kind of like the same idea with that. So you can just exit the loop. So if you have embedded loops, then it will just break the innermost loop. So if you have for loops, nested for loops like this, when you say break, you'll just break out of this for loop and then come back up here. So okay, let's see this example first. I have a sequence, I have a list of integers again, and I'm doing total until 5. My total until 5 starts with 0. I'm basically trying to sum up all my values until I get to 5. For a value in sequence, So for my each value, go through each of them and check if the value is 5. So if I get to 5, when I get to 5, I break out of my for loop, and then it's done, it's over. I have my total sum. Where you put your print statements, or where you put your break statements, or any line of code really, in the embedding, where you place that line is very important. If I print my value right here, well, or actually, let's not print our value. Why are we printing our value? We need to print our total sum, right? If I print this here, I mean, I might want to do this as well, but this is not going to give me my sum that I get in the end, okay? So this is, as you can see, is embedded inside my for loop. So here's the indentation of my for loop, and here's the indentation of my print statement, right? So if this is inside my for loop, so this will get executed as many times as my for loop continues. So in that case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, this is going to be executed. But when we get to 5, because we break out, it won't be executed. We will finally, in the final sum, we'll get the actual result, but we won't get just one output. Like, the only thing we need is 13, right? But what it gives us the sum of 1, and then the sum of, the addition of 2 and 1, and then you add 0, you still have 3, and then you add 4, you have 7, and then finally you add 6, you have 13, and when you get to 5, you break out of your loop, and this is over. So what we probably want to do in this case, not print out each step of the iteration process, but just print out the sum after the loop stops, right? So for that, I need to place these on the same indentation line so that we know this is not embedded in our for loop, and this line will execute after my for loop finishes. This seems very trivial. This is a trivial example, but this honestly causes so much trouble when you're doing like string manipulation and when you're working with arrays in general. So that works now. So make sure you always check your indentation. So this is an example of when you have nested loops, your break statement will actually break you out of the innermost loop. Let's now run the debug mode so that we can actually see what's happening here. We start with I equals to 1 and j equals to 1 for some reason. I don't know why that's the case, but it doesn't matter. When I get into my loop and say for I in range 2, of course my I is set to 0 because we need to start at 0. And then when I also run this line of my nested loop, I start the j with 0. So now I do my if check. I check if j equals 1, I will break. So in this case, j does not equal 1. So we should just get out. Like, we should not get out, but just skip over this break statement. And that's what we do. We now stepped out, and then we will print I and j. And then I go back up because I'm in this inner, this nested loop still. Now when I run this line, my j will equal 1. So now that my j equals 1, I will get into this if statement and I will break. So let's see that. Here I got into my if statement, I'm breaking, and then I broke out of the inner loop, but I'm still in my outer loop. Okay, so I went up I went up to my outermost loop, and I still have some action I need to complete here because I said in range 2. So I need to go up to 1 actually, because I said range 2. I will just run for 0 and for 1 in this case. So now my I is 1, and I get into the second loop again, into the loop that I just broke out of. So now I reset. So there I reset my j to 0. I restart again, and my j is 0 again, and I will skip over my break statement, and then I will print 1 and 0 this time here, as you can see, and then I will make my j1, and now I need to get into my if statement and break out of my inner loop again, and then I go up. Now I was wanting to just get to range 2, so I was just aiming to get to 1 in this case. So now when I step over, my loop will just end, and I will sorry. Okay, so that was my cat again. So now my debugging is completed. My cat is also interested in learning Python. Go-san. Very attentive to the mouse.